The night was colder than the desert had any right to be. A bitter wind sweeping down from the barren hills and curling through the darkened prairie. A lantern swung on the porch of a weather-beaten cabin, its flame trembling against the boards like a heartbeat. That faint glow lit the face of a girl who stood as still as a statue, her small hands clutching the frayed handle of a carpet bag. She was 17, though her wide, frightened eyes made her look younger, and the pale moonlight revealed cheeks hollowed by hunger and worry. Her father's voice cut through the silence, harsh and hurried, as though he feared his own courage might fail if he lingered. "She's yours now, Brennan. Papers signed, payment fair." His hand, rough from years of toil, shoved a folded contract into the pocket of the man who stood on the porch. The cowboy, broad-shouldered, 34, with lines carved deep by sun and solitude, shifted uneasily. His name was Thomas Brennan, a man who had worked the land so long he had almost forgotten what it meant to share space with another soul. The exchange of money was quick, almost careless. Bills slid from Brennan's calloused hand into the father's palm, vanishing into a coat that smelled of whiskey and desperation. Without a backward glance, the man turned and walked into the darkness, boots crunching on frozen earth, leaving his daughter behind as if she were no more than a debt repaid. The girl Eliza did not cry out, did not beg him to stay. Her silence was heavier than any scream. She stared at the ground, shoulders trembling, while Brennan studied her in the lantern's glow. He had expected a wife hardened by frontier life, someone prepared for the long winters and endless work of his ranch. Instead, he saw a child too fragile for the wilderness. The paper in his pocket said she was his. But as the wind howled across the empty land, Thomas Brennan felt something stir in his chest, a warning that nothing about this night was right. And in that silence, one question hung heavier than the storm clouds gathering above what fate had truly been delivered to his doorstep, and would either of them survive it? The Montana frontier stretched endless and merciless, a land both beautiful and cruel. To the east, rolling plains turned gold beneath summer sun, but in winter they hardened into a wasteland of ice and wind that could strip the breath from a man's chest. Mountains loomed on the horizon, their jagged peaks cutting into the sky like the edge of God's own knife, and between them lay valleys where snow piled waist deep and silence pressed so thick it made a man forget the sound of his own voice. It was here Thomas Brennan had carved out a life, one stubborn day at a time. His cabin stood at the edge of a narrow clearing, its logs darkened with age, the roof patched more times than he cared to count. A small corral leaned against the slope, holding a pair of weary horses and 3 longhorn cattle, their breath steaming in the cold night air. The nearest town lay 15 miles south, little more than a cluster of clapboard buildings, a general store, a saloon that never closed, a blacksmith whose hammer rang like a church bell. Beyond that, there was nothing but wilderness. For years, Thomas had lived alone, his only companions the land and the long shadows that gathered. When the sun dipped behind the mountains, he had grown used to solitude, the kind that seeped into a man's bones until it felt more natural than laughter. But now, standing in his doorway with a girl no older than 17 clutching her bag like a shield, he realized his world had shifted. He had asked for a wife to share his roof, perhaps a partner to ease the burdens of winter. Instead, fate had sent him a child innocent, fragile, and unprepared for the brutal truth of the West. The wind whistled through the pine trees, sharp and unforgiving, as if the land itself whispered a warning. Nothing about this arrangement would be simple. In a place where men vanished into blizzards and women's lives were often traded like cattle, survival demanded more than strength. It demanded sacrifice, and Thomas Brennan wondered if either of them had enough of it to endure what lay ahead. Eliza moved through the cabin like a ghost, her presence barely stirring the air. The wooden floor creaked under her steps, but she made no sound of her own, not a cough, not a word, not even the nervous hums young girls sometimes murmur when they are afraid. She kept her eyes low, hands folded tightly in front of her, as though any sudden movement might provoke something she could not control. Thomas Brennan watched her from the corner of his eye, careful not to let his gaze linger too long. She had placed her carpet bag by the hearth, though she never opened it. When he set a tin plate before her, heavy with beans and cornbread, she ate in small, deliberate bites, her hands trembling only when she thought he wasn't looking. Not once did she meet his eyes, but Brennan was no fool. He saw the fear in the way her shoulders stiffened when he shifted in his chair. He noticed how she flinched whenever his boots struck the floorboards. That kind of fear did not grow overnight. It was planted deep, rooted in betrayal. He knew well enough where it had come from, the father who had traded her life away for a handful of bills. Eliza carried that wound like a brand. In her silence lived a truth she did not speak. She had been sold, bartered as though she were cattle or land, her worth measured not in love but in money. She expected cruelty now, expected rough hands, harsh words, nights that would strip her of what little innocence she had left. But Thomas did nothing. He spoke little, asked less. He stoked the fire, patched the roof, tended to the animals, all with the same steady, quiet rhythm of a man used to solitude. And as the hours of their first night together stretched on, a question hung in Eliza's mind like a noose. Was this cowboy her jailer, or the only chance she had at something gentler than the world she'd known? Thomas sat at the table long after Eliza had retreated into the small back room, the lantern throwing restless shadows across the walls. The papers in his pocket said she was his wife, but when he replayed the image of her pale face, those wide frightened eyes, all he saw was a child left on his doorstep like an unwanted burden. His chest tightened with a guilt he hadn't expected. He had asked for a partner, someone to share the winters, to work beside him through the unforgiving seasons. What he'd received instead was a girl who had been betrayed by the one man who should have protected her. Loneliness pressed hard against him that night. He had lived with it for years, and sometimes it clawed at his soul so fierce he thought it might drive him mad. That loneliness was what had driven him to seek a wife in the first place. Yet as he stood outside the door where Eliza slept, her carpetbag untouched by the bed, he felt something stronger than loneliness. Conscience. With a quiet hand, he set a small brass key on the inside of the doorframe. "There's a lock," he murmured through the wood, his voice rough but steady. "Use it if you want." It was a strange thing to offer safety from himself, but it was all he could think to give her. In that moment, he made an unspoken vow. She would not be touched, not until she found her voice, not until she chose to trust him. He would not be her captor. He would be her shield. But out in the wilderness, the wind howled like a warning. Respect and kindness might win her trust, but the frontier was not merciful. And sooner or later, danger would come knocking. The first crack in their fragile peace came on a bitter morning, when frost clung to the cabin windows, and the sun had yet to lift above the mountains. Thomas was mending a fence post when the sound of hooves broke the stillness. At first, he thought it was a neighbor, a rare visitor. But when 4 riders appeared at the edge of his clearing, their silhouettes dark against the pale winter sky, his gut twisted with a warning. The man at the front wore a bowler hat tipped low, a cigar clamped in his teeth. His face was sharp and mean, the kind of face carved from greed. Eliza froze when she saw him from the cabin window, her breath fogging the glass. Her lips moved soundlessly, one word, one name: Uncle. The man dismounted with the swagger of someone who believed the land itself bent to his will. "Brennan," he barked, voice carrying across the yard. "You're keeping property that don't belong to you." He spat the words like venom. Thomas straightened, hammer in hand, eyes narrowing. "She ain't property. She's under my roof, and she stays as long as she chooses." The uncle's smirk was thin and cruel. "Funny thing, the law don't much care for what you think. Papers say she was promised elsewhere. You paid her pa, but he had no right to sell. That makes you a thief, Brennan. And thieves don't keep what ain't theirs." Behind him, the hired men shifted in their saddles, rifles gleaming under the pale sun. Eliza's fingers dug into the wood of the window ledge, her body shaking with the memory of being bartered away. She had been sold once, and now they meant to sell her again, this time with the law at their back. Thomas felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He had given Eliza a key for safety, a promise of protection. But promises meant little if he couldn't stand against the men who saw her only as profit. The frontier was cruel, and now its cruelty had a face. The air between the cabin and the riders grew thick with tension, each heartbeat dragging slower than the last. Thomas shifted his stance, ready for the fight he knew was coming. But then a sound broke the standoff, a sound so small it nearly vanished in the wind. Eliza, her voice. It was the first word Thomas had heard her speak, and it froze every man in place. The cabin door creaked open, and there she stood, her carpetbag clutched tight against her chest. Her face was pale, her body trembling, but her eyes, those eyes were steady, burning with something fierce. "You don't own me," she said, louder this time, directing her gaze at her uncle. Her words wavered, but they did not break. She reached into the bag, pulling out a handful of folded papers, their edges worn and stained with travel. "I know what you planned. I found the letters you sent." The uncle's sneer faltered. "Girl, you don't know what you're—" "Yes, I do," her voice cracked like a whip. "You were going to sell me. Not to a family, not to a home. 2 men in the territories who trade girls like cattle. I saw the names, the money promised." She held the letters high, her knuckles white, and turned her eyes to the man who had ridden with them, the town marshal, his star catching the morning light. The marshal shifted uneasily, taking the papers as Thomas passed them over. His eyes scanned the words, his frown deepening. When he looked back at the uncle, something hard had settled in his jaw. For the first time, Eliza stood not as a shadow, but as her own defender. Her voice, though fragile, cut sharper than any blade. And in that moment, Thomas Brennan knew this girl was no victim. She was a fighter, and her strength might just change everything. The clearing was so still that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The hired men shifted in, their saddles, rifles angled low but ready, their eyes darting between Thomas and the girl who had just shattered the silence. Thomas stepped forward, broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the frost-bitten ground, planting himself squarely between Eliza and the men who would tear her life apart. His hand hovered near the worn grip of his revolver, every muscle coiled for the violence he knew could explode in a heartbeat. "Best back away," he warned, his voice like gravel sliding down stone. "You come for her, you'll have to go through me." The uncle's laugh was sharp and ugly, but beneath the sound was a thread of unease. "You think one man can stand against 4 with rifles?" he sneered. But before a single gun could rise, the marshal's voice cut through. "That's enough." His horse snorted as he pushed forward, papers still clutched in his gloved hand. His face was grim, his eyes fixed on the uncle. "These letters tell the truth plain. You weren't protecting your kin, you were selling her, and the law won't turn a blind eye to that." The uncle's face drained of color as the marshal swung down from his horse. Steel cuffs clinked in his hand. The hired men exchanged wary glances, the fire gone from their bravado. None dared raise a rifle against the star pinned to the marshal's chest. As the uncle was dragged forward, cursing and spitting, Eliza stood taller than she ever had, her trembling gone, replaced by a steady strength. The cabin behind her was no longer a cage but a fortress, the place where she had found her voice and a man had proven his honor by shielding, not owning her. For the first time, Thomas saw not just a frightened girl, but a survivor reclaiming her power on the very ground meant to break her. When the riders disappeared down the trail, their silhouettes swallowed by the pale horizon, the clearing fell into a silence so heavy it rang. In the ears, only the slow crackle of the cabin's chimney broke the stillness, smoke curling into the gray sky like a quiet prayer. Eliza stood at the threshold, the cold biting at her cheeks, her hands still trembling around the last of the letters. For the first time in her 17 years, no man laid claim to her. Not her father, not her uncle, not even Thomas Brennan. Freedom felt strange, like stepping onto new earth after a lifetime in chains. Thomas shifted beside her, awkward in his own skin, as though he didn't know what to say. Finally, he spoke, voice low. "You've got choices now, Eliza. You can ride with the marshal into town, find a place among folks, or," he hesitated, eyes flicking toward the lonely cabin and the wide wilderness beyond. "Or you can stay." She studied him, searching for the catch, the trap. But there was none, only a man who had stood between her and danger, offering dignity where the world had stripped it away. Eliza breathed deep, snow stinging her lungs, and nodded. "I'll stay." And in that simple choice, something fragile but unshakably real began to grow. And so, beneath the hush of falling snow, Eliza chose to stay, not because she was bound, but because she was free. Yet her choice raises a question. that lingers long after the fire fades. If you had been in her place, standing at the edge of the wilderness with the whole world waiting, what would you have done? Would you have trusted Thomas Brennan, the quiet cowboy who offered protection instead of chains? Or would you have turned away, braving the unknown alone? The choice is yours, and perhaps in that choice lies the heart of this story. The Wild West was a land that tested every soul who dared call it home. It was a place where storms stripped men to the bone, where law bent beneath the weight of greed, and where loneliness could cut deeper than any knife. Yet it was also a land where redemption bloomed in the unlikeliest places, where a frightened girl could find her voice, and a hardened cowboy could remember the meaning of honor. The truth is simple, though hard-earned. Strength is not measured in fists or rifles, but in the courage to stand tall when silence would be easier. And love, the kind that endures even the harshest winter, is never bought, it is given freely, built on trust and respect. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more tales of the Wild West, where every ending holds a new beginning.